Okay, maybe one more minute, then we can start. Just a few people still joining. Right, welcome everyone. We're just going to wait about 30 more seconds for a few people to join. Looking forward to this webinar.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Okay, so without further delay, we'll start with some intros and then we'll get started with the program. So just a couple of housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted on the History Workshops YouTube page. And just a request to everyone who's not a speaker to please mute themselves and to turn off their video. That's because some people are joining on low bandwidth. Okay, so welcome to today's History Workshop webinar. It's a book launch. The book is by Dr. Francesca Rueedi from Zurich. And the book is called The Vaal Uprising of 1984 and the Struggle for Freedom in South Africa. Just some quick bios. Dr. Rueedi is no stranger to people in this webinar. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Zurich. She was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the History Workshop here at WITS. And we have a respondent. We're very fortunate to have a respondent, Mrs. Dokas Relitsela, who is a retired social worker and a community development worker. She was the co-founder of the Vaal Civic Association and the Vaal Organization of Women. And she's also a former soldier in MK, in Konto Esizwe. We also have a discussant, Dr. Shepa Molloy, who is also no stranger to this webinar. Dr. Molloy is a senior lecturer in the history department at the University of the Free State. So just briefly, the sequence of events, and I'm Kasonde Mukonde, I'm a student in the history workshop. I'll be moderating. So just briefly, the sequence of the program. First, we'll have Francesca speaking for 15 minutes about her book. And then we'll have Mrs. Dokas Relitsela responding for about 15 minutes about the significance of this period, this very important period in recent South African history. And then Dr. Molloy, who will be a discussant, he'll give us some thoughts on the book. And before we open up to questions from the general audience, Francesca, Dr. Rueedi will give us a response to a couple of things that Dr. Molloy picks up. And we encourage people to use the chat to put in comments. Otherwise, we will open for comments and questions at the end. So I'm gonna hand over to Francesca.
Great, let me quickly share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yes, we
Great.
can, yeah.
All right. So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about my book today. I'm very pleased to see so many familiar faces, and of course, it's always very nice to be back in this space, even though it's virtual now. I would like to thank Njogu Morgan, Laura Phillips, and Kasonde Mukonde for organizing the event, and of course, Dorcas Raditsela and Tsepo Moloi for preparing responses. My book looks at one of the most significant moments of popular protest in recent South African history, the Vaal Uprising of 1984. On the 3rd of September 1984, the townships of the Vaal Triangle to the south of Johannesburg were catapulted to the forefront of the struggle for freedom. On this day, thousands gathered to march to the offices of the Orange Vaal Development Board. Their aim was to demand the resignation of all African councillors and the scrapping of a recent rent increase of R5.90 per month. A meeting a few days prior, organized by the Vaal Civic Association, had resolved that on the 3rd of September, all workers would stay away from work and students from school. Businesses belonging to councillors would be boycotted. But what was planned to be a peaceful protest march escalated into violence when police and councillors began shooting at crowds. The Vile Uprising signaled the beginning of the insurrectionary period of the mid-1980s. This period, like no other period in recent South African history, symbolized the search for a new order and demands for full emancipatory citizenship. Yet despite its significance, remarkably little is known about the unfolding of the revolt, the ideas and aspirations that precipitated it, and the impact it had. Two aspects appeared particularly striking to contemporary observers, and that was on one hand the location of the revolt and the intensity of the violence on the other hand. The Vaal Triangle at that point was an area that had seen slow political mobilization, and it was therefore an unexpected site for an uprising. And this is really what interested me in this subject, and what is at the core of the book, is to understand the roots, causes, and the nature of the uprising, the relationships between political mobilization and collective violence, the relationships between above and underground structures, and this refers to both the political and the military underground, and to situate the uprising within a broader context for the struggle for freedom. I am particularly interested in grassroots political ideas and the ways in which everyday life in the township shaped aspirations, hopes, and visions of freedom. And I briefly want to sketch some of the arguments and some of the themes I'm covering in the book. And of course, this is not comprehensive, so this is just to provide some insights. The first point is around the historical significance of the home. In my book, I am arguing that in order to understand the uprising of the mid-1980s, we need to look at struggles over housing and living conditions during earlier periods. In contrast to many analyses that take the implementation of reforms during the late 1970s as their starting point, this book traces the development of emancipatory ideas back to the mid-20th century. Within a context of ethnic state formation, the production of home spaces in the cities was deeply political and signified a claim to the city. The home was key to one's sense of belonging, and it signified a claim to the city. It also provided opportunity to assert one's dignity in the face of oppression and discrimination. The book therefore shows that the emergence of new political subjectivities, which were at the core of protest politics in 1984, were shaped by everyday struggles for a better life. The second point I want to make concerns changing popular expectations, demands, and claims on the state with regards to living condition and housing in particular. The reformation of local government altered the ways in which communities envisaged their relationship with the state. Significantly, debates regarding the provision and subsidizing of services and housing shaped protest politics in the region, as this book shows. In the Vaal Triangle, one of the people who played a key role in spearheading reforms during the 1970s was a man called John Knutze. John Knutze was the director of the Sebokeng Management Board and later the Vaal Triangle Administration Board. Even before it became official policy, Knudse was key in pushing for the development of townships, and he was also at the forefront of implementing proto-reforms in housing that were aimed to encourage secure tenure, better houses, and home ownership. But the fiscal burden for developing and upgrading the townships was placed on the shoulders of township residents through the implementation of frequent rent increases. Between 1977 and 1984, rent, which included house rental but also service charges, increased by a staggering 427%. And this basically made the Vaal Triangle the most expensive area in South Africa. While a small percentage of the population benefited from increasing living standards, for the majority, their expectations for improved living conditions and better housing was frustrated. Social stratification increased as a result. And the people at the forefront of implementing these rent increases were members of the community councils and later the Black local authorities, who soon came to be blamed for poor living conditions. And unfortunately, there's no time to go into the issue of Black local authorities here, but of course, if somebody wants to ask a question in the Q&A, there should be time. This is the context in which political mobilization began in earnest, which leads me to my next point. My third point is about the origins of political ideas and the relationships between the liberation movements and grassroots struggles. Oral history interviews show that new political subjectivities were very much rooted at the intersection of everyday lived experiences and broader ideological concerns. And it is this overlap that made political mobilization particularly successful during this period, as I argue in my book. As I also show, women, even though it was only a handful of women, played a key role in shaping civic politics at that time, both civic politics and the ANC underground. Women, of course, were often most acutely affected by rent increases, and they were also disproportionately affected by evictions. Women could not rent houses in their own names, and they were often heavily dependent on male relatives. And of course, they also carried the burden of having to make ends meet. This confluence of everyday grievances and broader ideological concerns also partly accounts for the ascendancy of Charterism in the region. Importantly, Charterist organizations were at the forefront of taking up the rent issue. They captured the popular imagination of local communities, and their rhetoric resonated with everyday concerns. So language, I argue, played an important role in articulating these ideas, and it also played a role in constituting the political community. The Vaal Civic Association espoused ideals that resembled those of a social democratic welfare state, which would ensure equal access to pensions, housing, and other basic services. By then, ANC underground units had been established, and even though their capacity to stir mass mobilization remained modest, they played an important role in framing bread and butter issues within a broader vision of freedom. And again, interestingly, one of the key ANC underground operatives was a woman called Maletanta, who was then already in her 60s and whose inconspicuous demeanor, age, and gender allowed her to smuggle ANC material into the country and to remain off the radar of the security branch for quite some time. And on a side note, I still hope that somebody will one day write her biography, because she really played a very important role in this region. The complex relationships between the ANC underground and civic structures is a topic that is still in its infancy, and my book aims to contribute towards this debate. And of course, I'm very pleased that Dorcas Raditsela is a speaker today, because she knows probably more than anyone about these issues, the connections between the ANC underground and civic matters. As a consequence of these developments, two major issues were pushed into the forefront of public debate. It was on one hand representation and governance, and on the other hand, it was the role of government in providing and subsidizing services and housing. The meaning of emancipatory citizenship and the rights that would come with it therefore gained center stage. And as I will elaborate in a moment, it is the uprising itself that then facilitated that these debates translated into practice on the ground. By 1984, we therefore see increasing opposition to the councils and increasing discontent and anger regarding frequent rent increases. When the Lekwa Town Council announced yet another increase in August 1984, the Vaal Civic Association organized a series of meetings that eventually led to the protest march on the 3rd of September 1984. What was particularly striking, as I mentioned at the beginning, is how rapidly protests became engulfed in violence. I am arguing in my book that the Vaal Civic Association lost control very quickly, and this provided the space for different actors to emerge. There are, of course, other reasons why it became so violent, but again, there's unfortunately not enough time to go into it here. So I would like to make my fourth point now, which is about the contingency of protest action and the diversity of voices and experiences. A close reading of the sources highlights that tensions were rising days before the uprising began, and that violence ensued in some of the smaller townships, such as Bopelong, in late August already. My book tries to disentangle the different triggers, motivations, and experiences. And one of those triggers, which I argue was very significant, was the rumor of violence, and particularly the rumor that young children had been shot dead. So news that young children were shot by police and councillors exacerbated collective anger and confirmed the perception that indeed the police and the councillors were waging a war against township residents. The records of the demonstration trial, which this book is drawing on, provide very detailed insights into some of the aspects of the uprising, but they do not contain the voices of small groups, independent crowds, and of course the ANC underground, which is for very obvious reasons. People would not have spoken about the connection to the ANC in this treason trial. So of course the reasons for these silences are partly due to the legal nature of these sources. So using both archival sources and oral history entries shows the incredible complexity and the messiness of the uprising. In order to capture this messiness and to make sense of the contradictions and the ambiguities, my book traces the movements of different actors on that day. So on this slide, we see the route that the marchers took and the site where they were stopped by the riot police. And this is where the spatiality of the townships becomes significant, for looking at the movements of different actors in space highlights how the side streets, for example, facilitated different types of confrontations compared to the main roads. We also see how generational tensions were manifested in space. Lists of those that were shot dead indicate that all age groups were represented. Evidence also shows that the motivation for converging outside councillors' houses were diverse. So while some participants who gathered outside the councillors' houses were motivated by political beliefs, other ones wanted to settle scores. It was during the uprising that the crowd re-emerged as a historical force. And even though the momentum of the crowd could not be sustained, it disrupted the coercive and administrative capacities of the state, and it provided the opportunity for new protest politics to emerge. The final point I want to emphasize very directly follows on from this, arguing that the uprising constituted a moment of great rupture, loss, and uncertainty. It facilitated new ways of thinking about the future, about what kind of political and social order was feasible and desirable. What we therefore see in the aftermath of the uprising is the translation of earlier ideas regarding governance and socioeconomic rights into practice. Street, area, and block committees were established that began to take over some of the administrative matters. Based on the concept of popular democracy, the Vaal Civic Association and its street committees came to signify an alternative form of government, one that would be representative, transparent, and just. Closely intertwined with new visions of governance were demands for socioeconomic rights. What emerged during the mid-1980s was a more radical vision of what constituted a dignified, equal, and free life. And this is perhaps the key significance of this period, the articulation of popular expectations and the meaning and rethinking of the meaning of citizenship and freedom. To conclude, my book shows that the struggle against apartheid was not just a struggle for political freedom, but also a struggle for freedom from inequality and freedom from poverty. It was not only a struggle against a particular political framework, but also a struggle for a new social, political, and economic order. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Dorcas, are you ready to give a few comments?
Yes, I'm ready to give
Okay.
comment.
All right, handing over to you, madam.
Yeah, thank you very much, Program Director, for giving me this opportunity. And I would say in this season of women, so that I make an input on the launch of the book by Francisca Rueedi, named the title is The Vaal Uprising of 1984. With this opportunity, as I say, is the season of women. I'm simply saying because normally women's organizations do celebrate, and the nation as well celebrates in August. But now that we are in September, I feel that women should be celebrated every day because, of course, women make life every day, I suppose. I also wish to greet everyone who is part of this launch. Ke a le dumedisa ka tlhompho e kgolo. Nna ke le ke ga Dorcas Raditsela. Going forward, I would say that I first met Francisca in 2010 as she was busy with her research. It was indeed a long journey for more than 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, with her doing her research. In the period up to today, I came to know her better, know her lovely family, and her family came to know my family. I even happened to meet Andile, who I thought was her colleague. Andile, sorry. But only to realize that Andile and Francisca eventually married and have two lovely little boys. I hope, Andile, I'm sorry, I hope you're not doing the underground with Francisca, because I was doing the underground for the ANC. Fine. In the book, when I received the book, I was not able to read it as in reading and finishing a book. But so far, as I was able to read some chapters, I came to note a couple of things. Firstly, I see that Francisca has been very thorough. A period of 10 years says it all. She was thorough in her research. The accounts and stories in the book are of real people who were interviewed, meaning that Francisca definitely is unassuming in her writing the book. I can also say that the book is inspirational for those, especially for those who shared their stories and those who are still going to read it, I think are going to be inspired. And inspiration in the fact that whilst they were contributing their stories like myself, it gave me a sense of wanting to share more stories, meaning that it gives me an opportunity to begin to make a write-up. And I suppose that is what all other people who read the book and have contributed would want to do. I'm challenged to read more of the book, and the work that she did helped me to document details of the journey I took. I, in the meantime, want to thank all those who shared their stories from their own perspectives and angles during their participation in the events in 1984, and those who led struggles during that time as their accounts have also made me understand more about the events of the time to complete my understanding of the uprisings and a struggle for liberation inside the country beyond September 3. Coming to September 3, I have a sense that given Francisca's book and research, I would not be able to go in depth into the events of September 3, but I would rather give a sense of my involvement during the struggle for liberation. And my involvement dates back to the family I was raised in. My mother and father had an influence on my political outlook of life. My mother, having been one of those women who marched to the residential police station in 1956, related to me about it and other events of a political nature. And when the security police warned them about my activities later on in life, they only alerted me and never admonished me. So that gave me the courage to continue in the struggle. And I think some of the things that I'm saying are actually more explained in the book of why I decided to be involved in the struggle. My involvement was influenced by coming from the background of the poor and downtrodden. And as a student at the University of the North, my background as a social worker and as a community development worker exposed me to more and more hardships of the African people, which could never be addressed under the settler state machinery, and how it worked against them, that is the undertrodden, in all facets of their lives. I came to realize that being a social worker of the time, there was no way of making a difference in people's lives for their betterment, but only to serve the government and system of race oppression, who was my employer. Again, when Sebokeng Hospital was established in 1980-1981, I was appointed as the only Black female hospital board member, with mostly white and Black males. Equally, being a board member made me realize that serving the system did not bring any change to people's well-being, but it was just tokenism. Well, fortunately, maybe meeting with Isora Ditsela and Zimuremi, who approached me to work with them in community projects, allowed me to address some of the frustrations that I had at work. And I became more and more involved in progressive and resistance formation, some of them being the Industrial Aid Center, the Black Search, Learn and Teach, and later being involved in the formation of the Vaal Civic Association and the Vaal Organization of Women, which we called Vaal, and also the Mass Democratic Movement. Iso Raditsela was to be my husband in 1980. And I think we're not doing the underground. We were later to join the ANC and Umkondo Sizwe when we went to see my sister, Maele Dolo, who was already in exile in Botswana and had later gone to teach at Solomon Mahlangu Freedom College in Somavco, an African National Congress school in Tanzania. We undertook underground work and mobilized for September 3 whilst inside the country, but obviously being in touch with the ANC. We were forced to leave the country as a special branch when before the events erupted. The special branch had told us that we would be in trouble or not see the light of day should the march take place. So it was clear that we would no longer operate and carry out the planned underground activities beyond the 3rd of September. And hence, we left the country. So in exile, after the military training in Angola, I went for further training in Moscow in the Soviet Union. And I came back to Botswana to continue underground work. But at the time, I was also working as a lecturer at the University of Botswana while carrying out the work of the ANC. In 1991, I was repatriated back to South Africa, and I was deployed at the African National Congress offices, that is headquarters, by Comrade Winnie Mandela, where I also worked with comrades Jackie Selebi and Advocate Dalu Mpofu, where we're repatriating and resettling the returning comrades from exile. Our current situation has become a little bit difficult one. It is far from what we fought for and envisioned as an outcome. We were fighting for a better life for the nation and for self-determination. The socio-economic development and progression has not been realized. Inequality is still the order of the day. This is also evidenced by the fact that the socio-economic and political situation in the townships and rural areas are not what it's supposed to be. And of course, it gives a sense that our vision has been deferred. Apparently, it is not yet freedom as was envisioned, meaning that the struggle continues as I see it. I want to say that I thank Francisca for this wonderful and incisive book. I wish to congratulate Francisca on this journey and wish her well, as I believe this book is the starting point or the middle point while we wait for the next installment. And Francisca, I hope I'm not assuming something here or putting pressure on you for the next installment. I hope not, but if it is pressure, may I be forgiven in advance. However, I suppose it is positive pressure. Having given that input, I wish to say that thank you very much for listening to me, and I thank you all.
Thank you so much, Madam Dr. Sralitsela. That's very spellbinding, and I'm sure Francesca welcomes the positive pressure. We're going to move to our discussant, Dr. Shepomoloi, to just give his thoughts on the book. Hello?
Yep. Sepo.
Oh, yes.
Bulga. Give me some minutes, a second. Yeah, thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
I think I should also echo Mayor Raditsela and congratulate Francesca for a fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading it. I went up to chapter 7, so I haven't read the conclusion. I think I'll just want to touch on 3 points. The first one, I think what the book does, which I think it does excellently, is to demonstrate the role of the ANC underground in influencing mass mobilization in the Vaal. Quite a number of books and articles that have been written on the 80s. I haven't come across any that goes into detail as you have. And the second point that I would like to touch on is the role of women, especially mature women, mature women in the underground work. I think that was, for me, that was very interesting. The third point, which I read, but I still need to go back and read it carefully, is the post-1984 period. You touch on that period, demonstrating that because of the detentions and people going to exile, some into hiding from the security police, there was that disruption of political mobilization and organization in the Vaal, because now we had new leadership coming, assuming a position. So let me read, because of so that I don't waste time, what I noted down here. I think, I mean, like I've just mentioned, that a significant number of books and journal articles on the 80s township politics or protest, if you like, in South Africa have been published. And these undoubtedly have enriched our understanding about the subject. However, Francesca's book, The Vile Uprising of '84, I thought it discusses some of the already known aspects about the 1980s township politics, but in a more imaginative way. And more importantly, like I mentioned when I started, that she also discusses the role of the ANC underground, which I think that's very interesting and important for historiography. The book, just like Raditila mentioned, that it is well researched and it's easy to read. I think going through the book, I think you are lucky to get people who were directly involved before the 3rd of September 1984 and on the day of September and post that date, who gave you those interviews. They're very rich, you can tell. I mean, these are people who were directly involved in the politics of the Vaal. I like the fact that you started your book with the background about the origins of the townships in the Vaal, also demonstrating the differences of how the residents in those townships engaged in politics, or lack of thereof, but especially residents who had just been removed from forcefully removed from the old locations. And for me, what was interesting is throughout the book, you can tell that Sharpeville, compared to the other townships which were established, it's different. I mean, their politics, people there operate differently, which I thought probably that's something probably might have wanted to engage in a bit more. And you also mentioned that the Vaal Triangle, unlike other places, townships, it lagged behind in terms of political mobilization and organization in particular. I was a bit worried initially in the initial chapters, because it kept on referring to the fresh memories of the Sharpeville massacre, which, I mean, it's a legit, a good point to make. But I thought there was more to it than just the fresh memories of the massacre, especially amongst the young people who did not experience that. but you dealt with that towards the end of the book. And the fact, I also like the fact that you also indicated, just to emphasize the point, that there was lack of mobilization, that even 76 student uprisings did not affect the townships, which I found it very interesting because of the close proximity between Sharpeville townships and Soweto. And you also mentioned in your book that some of the young people from Sharpeville used to go to Soweto and so on. I think what struck me about the book is you dismiss the two competing narratives offered by the government and the analysts, journalists, and scholars about the reasons, explaining the reasons for the revolt in the Vaal. For example, the government, you mentioned that it claimed that the revolt had been instigated and led by external agitators. And then the other group, the analysts, journalists, scholars, emphasized the localized nature of grievances and the spontaneity of the revolt. And we know, I mean, in other townships, especially in the former PWV, the local grievances, the bread and butter issues were key in terms of mobilizing the residents. But you argue that the Vaal Uprising was prodded by the reimagination of a country and its future, and the radical demand for full emancipatory citizenship that included material benefits, equality, and life free from poverty and oppression. And for me, I found it interesting that you kind of like, for you, that came through as a result of the influence of the ANC's underground message or operatives, and others, because they combined the local struggle and the national struggle, which then they started conscientizing the residents of the township. But I wonder how much of that did filter down beyond those who were close to them, especially the members of the Vaal Association, Civic Association, and others. But how much of that did filter down to students at the local level, youth, and so on? Because later, especially post-95, we see different kind of politics taking place in the Vaal. You also mentioned, interestingly, just to give a clear picture as to how the political mobilization came about in the Vaal. But you also, I mean, you brought gradually and clearly that 1984 was a culmination of years of tension between the residents of the Vaal and the African councillors, who assumed power in the late 70s and continued into the 1980s through the BLA Act of 1982. So in the 70s, you try to show that the members or residents who were adherents of the Black consciousness movement, who had connection with others in Soweto and probably in other places. But you also go on to allude, which I found it interesting, to allude to the young Christian workers. I thought you would have discussed that, the role of the YCW a bit more, because I mean, the Vaal, it's an industrial hub with the workers, young workers, and so forth. I thought just to see how the politics of the 70s in the Vaal were in terms of conscientization and all. And what also I found it very interesting, and I've read this, I mean, in seeking work, that in spite of this, the community council and later the town council constantly increasing rent and tariffs. But the people in these townships, they never organize. You know, they are angry, of course. They challenge the councillors. I mean, you allude to one march by students earlier on, but there's nothing happening seemingly. So I'm starting to wonder. I mean, this is 1982 when the councillors increased increased the rent with 16 rand by 16 rand. But that, I mean, now you have new generations from the 1960s. I mean, how much of that memory is still there? Yes, in terms of what happened is still there, of course, but in terms of mobilizing and organizing, what was happening? And I think you try to, in trying to show the role and the importance of the ANC's underground, influence of the ANC's underground, you show that it was after Dorcas and Tate Raditsela had returned from Botswana, where they interacted with the ANC and received training, that the Vaal Civic Association was formed in 1983. And of course, because many people were scared to take over, to take up positions within the civic association. So members or people who were directly involved or indirectly linked with the ANC occupied the leadership positions of the ANC. And that, I think for you, this is what I thought the book is trying to show, that because of that, the Charterist message was able to be fermented within the Vaal townships. So I think for me that is very important, because we, I mean, myself included, we try to show the link between what was happening locally inside the South African, the townships, and the ANC exile. But I don't think we have managed to clearly indicate it or demonstrate it as you have in your book. And I thought that was very important. And then just to, in conclusion, I think you discuss the role of women, both in underground and above ground roles very well. And I think the role of mature women, for me, I mean, it's new. I found it very interesting that they decided to recruit women who would not be easily identified as doing this kind of work, being to go to Botswana to get banned material and distribute it inside South Africa. So I thought that was also very important. So I was wondering about the young women, especially in the 80s, you know, COSAS members and so forth. And I saw that you also used the book written by Bridget on women, female COSAS members. So I thought probably the role of young women, you know, students in the 80s will also come out in the book. Finally, like I said, that I found very a discussion and then the transition post 1984 very interesting, because now you see that there's the police, the security police, have identified those who were very prominent. They hunt them down, they leave the country, some of them, some go into hiding and so forth. But then you have this new leadership coming up. And I mean, Carter writes about this in Alexandra, where you have this, the mushrooming of people's courts, and we know what happened there. But similarly, it seems like similar Operation App happened in the Vaal. And then I think the role, which I like I said, that I haven't gone through the last chapters, but the role of the local military units, I thought that it's an interesting addition to the study of the 1980s politics. You write about the Valimo and the AIDS mates. I thought, I mean, and then I can understand, I mean, it's a book, you're given a certain space. but I thought it's something probably you might want to research, and I'm sure you've got material, but to write on more in detail about this estimates and the Valimo, because in the 1990s, we have, especially in the Vaal, we have this problem between those, when the ANC had been unbanned, people were trying to establish branches in the townships, and those who were part of this units. I mean, in the 1990s, we've got this self-defense unit, but I'm not sure if any of the members of the Valimo and estimates were part of that. But we've got this serious tension, and then people are killed between those who are trying to establish the ANC within the Vaal and those who felt that they were real leaders who were supposed to take over the townships. I will stop there, and I hope I didn't go over your time, Chair.
No, thank you so much,
Well
Doc.
done,
Actually, that's
Sepo.
my alarm.
Thank
You finished right on time. Thank you. Very thorough comments. Without wasting time, I think, Francesca, if you have some responses to that.
So, I mean, first of all, thank you so much, Dorcas, for such a generous
Sorry, you're a little faint. The sound.
No, I'm afraid not. On your headset, it looks like there is a mic that's. If you move
yeah,
there, yeah.
I think that's it. So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much, Dorcas, for such a generous input. And it is certainly true. I was incredibly fortunate because when I started my research around 2009, I had so many people assisting me and encouraging me, and at times rescuing me when I got lost, and welcoming me into their homes and sharing their often very painful stories with me. So this book would not have been possible without the support of people from the Vaal Triangle. So yes, I absolutely agree with Sepp. I was very lucky to have or to enjoy the support of so many people whilst conducting the research. So I just want to pick up on a few points to not spend too much time. The question regarding Sharpeville, yes, I think it's a very interesting point. Why was Sharpeville different? I'm trying to show that Sharpeville was historically claimed more by BC groups and that Charterist organizations before 1984 managed to make less inroads into Sharpeville, and therefore Sharpeville then develops its own distinct politics. So you're absolutely right. I don't dedicate a huge part of the book to that. And I think it would be an interesting study to do, to actually look at Sharpeville during the 1980s, like in more detail. Also about the issue of slow political mobilization. So I think what is interesting is that in 1976, student protests do occur. And I also know that some schools, for example, are burned down, but it's not as sustained as in other areas, which then led me to ask the question as to why is there such slow political mobilization? So yes, I think by then the memory of Sharpeville is fading, but it's also a community that was very unsettled because of frequent forced removals. So people struggled to put down roots because they were frequently removed during this period. That's one thing. Of course, it's also a lack of, or the kind of absence of, or maybe more of a lack of certain tertiary institutions, but also young people going to schools in areas such as Soweto. So there's a kind of perhaps not as many student leaders being present in that region. And one of them. Sorry. One of them, of course, is David Moisi, who then joins MK in the late 1970s and who played a very important role in student politics in the Vaal Triangle. So it's a memory of Sharpo is one thing, but it's got other reasons why political mobilization remains slow. And yes, forced removals is one of the reasons. And yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's always a question of ANC material is being brought back into the country. To what extent are these messages filtered down to people on the ground? And yes, you're right in pointing out that, of course, it doesn't necessarily reach thousands of people. I think that would be a claim that one can't make. I think it is important in shaping the politics of the Vaal Civic Association. And because the Vaal Civic Association plays such an important role in mobilizing for September 3, it does impact on the kind of discussions within the VCA. But of course, people on the ground develop their own ideas and their own visions. But I think what makes Chartist politics more successful during this period is because the language used and the issues that are being addressed very much resonate with people on the ground. So it's in fact COSAS who first takes up the rent issue in 1982. And then the VCA in 1983. So they address popular grievances that are not really being addressed to the same extent by other organizations. And then the role of women in the 1980s. So young women, and I think Emily Bridges' book, of course, is fantastic in providing insights into that. Young women do play a significant role, but they are, in the organizations I looked at, there are fewer. But those that do become involved are often at the forefront of popular protest. And I discuss it briefly in the last chapter when I talk about the militarized youth units, is that a significant number of one of those units, in fact, consists of young women. And so they are no less radical than their male counterparts. So this is an important group that plays a role in protest politics. And I have, in fact, written an article on Ace Mates that came out in JSAS last year, where I go into more detail about how they, in their own view, implemented People's War, especially around Sebokeng in 1985, 1986. So I do write about that in more detail elsewhere. I think that's more or less my response.
Well, thank you so much. So I see there's a comment from Anne Heffernan. Would you like to turn on your mic or should I read it out? And
I can if you'd like me to. Here I am. Hi.
All right, great.
Thank you so much to all three speakers for a really interesting discussion, and particularly to Maralitsela for her personal reflections on the importance of the book. That was fascinating. I just had a question, Franzi. You showed us that map during your presentation of the kind of progression of the march on the 3rd of September and talked about how sort of side streets were very important. And you also, if I heard you correctly, mentioned the sort of ways that generational differences and cleavages could be seen in the space. If I might have misheard, but I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, about how generation, you can say something about gender too, but how generation related to space in the uprising. Thanks.
Do you want to take a round of questions or should I respond?
Yes, let's just take Matime Papane has a question. If you can turn on your mic. Matime, sorry, Matime.
Hi.
Hello, hi.
Hi, Chair. It's
Great.
not so much a question. I think I just wanted to raise a few issues. And I think taking from what Ms. Maralitsela was talking to, but then also to the discussant as well. Some of the issues that they raise and assertions they make, if I can be able to talk to some of those, particularly linked to the role of Sharpeville. I was born in Sharpeville, so I will talk a bit about that and try to say what was my picture about that. But then also the link between 1960 moving forward. It's like as if since 1960 there was death and 1984 happens, but it was something close by in 1976 that happened, and the Vaal wasn't involved. Just to say that there's been a lot of activity, even though the book didn't focus on those. It might have been, and I think in the last discussion that we had, the international launch, that was also brought to the fore in terms of what actually was the picture. And for me, critical to this was that if you can look into, because particularly around Sharpeville, yes, people say it was Black conscious. I don't think so much Black conscious. It was more PAC, Pan-Africanist, more than Black consciousness. But then also in that effect, it then linked to 1960. But then when you link that up with the event that followed after that, you'll find the resurgence of BCP, particularly linked to the activity of 1984, but then also a bit earlier, where earlier you'll have noted Black consciousness, but then around Sharpeville, what was called Sharpeville Youth Club, then Kutsu Matsabu, Vose Shabalala gang, their establishment. And that in itself talks a lot. It talks a lot about Sharpeville, but it talks a lot about the Vaal in essence, but then also connection or connecting to Soweto as well. When the Sharpeville Youth Club was launched, the politics around the youth, and particularly Lekwa Shandu High School youth, but then how that after the arrest of Ngutseyo sentenced to Robben Island and the banishment of some of the leaders there, and Vose Shabalala became a leader of the South African student movement, and he was based in Everton. But the Soweto Uprising in 1976 sort of huge bearing around Everton and what happens there. If one can look and dive deep into that history there, what happens around Everton schools, Temba in particular, and Wilberforce area, and the connection to the Soweto Uprisings, and you're taking like leaders like Matthew Morobe and the like, and the connection of that, and the trials of Sharpeville Youth Club in Joburg. Around that case, but then when you then bring it forward again, there's been a lot of activities around 1976. Even though I think our doctors did say there were sporadic battles in schools around the Vaal, whether it's like Ashandu in its booking, and I know a number of schools in Everton as well. But they weren't like in the size and the coordinated fashion like in Soweto. And that's why Soweto became prominent. But then you connect the issue around the prominence of Black consciousness in Sharpeville around 1984. Let me just hint. There was a Vaal Civic Association. It has its more deeper roots in Sebokeng and Everton with Everton ratepayers. But then in the other townships, there will be committees and structures. But in Sharpeville, we will then have a committee that was led by Father Muselani. Even though that Father Muselani was a Black consciousness leader and so on, but the area around that was not necessary then, therefore, Black consciousness. You still have the residual of PAC and then also the ANC roots also within the township as well. But the activities as coordinated overall for 1984 happens like whilst cutting across. It wasn't like sporadic and it was a different approach. It might have been a different politics around Sharpeville. But then the aftermath also, there's somebody who spoke about the rise of Walimo and so on. You'll note that most organizations were banned and most leaders were imprisoned and so on in 1984, and the aftermath of 1984 and 1985 state of emergencies and so on. There was a lot of repression within the region as well. Now, with that on hold at play, you will note that a lot of sporadic little organizations emerge, whether it's Valimo in Sebokeng, around Sebokeng areas, whether it's Ace Mates around the guy, or a comrade of ours who was called Ace, and so on. But then the issue is that the rebuilding happens from 1984 again to sustain the struggles of the right and to ensure that this thing is keeping hold nationally as well, because it wasn't broken immediately after that. But then the sustenance of that was what happened differently with the relaunching of the Vaal Civic Association, reformation of all the youth structures and so on. But in the sporadic reaction to some of the youths in the township, in the Valimo and so on, were more sporadic and not well spread around the region. It was more around Sebokeng, Valimo, for instance, it was a Sebokeng, and the Ace Maids was around there, but it was mainly youth. But then the actual rebuilding took some time to happen, linked to structures of the UDF and so on. And I just wanted to hint on those few issues and just to add into what colleagues say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maxime. I think, Francesca, you have quite a few comments and question to address. Yeah, and I don't think we'll have time for another round because we've gone over an hour. But if any of the speakers would like to say something after you, whether Mrs. Dorcas Ralitsela or Doc Molloy, if they would like to say anything, but these could also be your concluding remarks.
Great. So thank you for the questions and input. So Anne, I think that's to address your question, how did generational difference reflect in space? One of the things that came out when I was conducting interviews was that there was a younger generation who felt that a protest march was not sufficient. They felt that the state had to be confronted in a more overt way, perhaps, and they utilized the space in a different way. So you see small groups of especially young people moving through the townships prior to the protest march. Some of them even start the night before the protest march. They set up barricades, they confront councillors. And so what I'm arguing is that the uprising itself provides a platform for different actors to emerge. But you have the main protest march that is in the main road, and then you have independent groups that some of them are somehow linked, some of them are completely independent, and they try to push their own agenda. And some of them do feel that they need to confront the councillors very directly. So it's really in the side streets where these confrontations happen much more than in the main road. And then Shelley, your input, thank you so much for your input, which I think is absolutely fantastic because, of course, you were there as an activist, and I think it's great to engage these issues with people who were actually there during that time. So you touch on a very, very important issue, which unfortunately is not explained in great detail in the book, and that's the issue of politics around Sharpeville, around the Sharpeville Youth Club. So I did touch on it during a few pages, I think, but did not elaborate in more detail. But you're absolutely right that, of course, the Sharpeville Youth Club plays an incredibly important role in providing a platform to discuss politics, to discuss culture, to connect people. Tom Lott, for example, also writes about this. And so I try to include it because it's a very important moment in the history of this region. And yes, Sharpeville does play a very important role, but I had to unfortunately condense it a bit because of constraints in terms of space. But yes, it's a very important place where young people get together and discuss culture, politics, and so on. And the issue of the schools. So one of the things that I did notice is that, as I mentioned earlier, there are these moments of protest in 1976, but it appears to be less organized and less coherent than in places like Soweto. So I think it's certainly not absent, but the question is, why is it not quite as coherent? That's what I'm trying partly to address in the book. But yes, and then again, of course, the rebuilding of civic structures after 1984 which is a kind of, there's a brief period of a sort of lull or vacuum that emerges, and then this difficulty of rebuilding the organization, which, I mean, you would of course know probably much more about because you were involved in rebuilding of these structures, but it's an important issue as to how to rebuild the structures during a time of heightened repression and clamping down on any public form of protest. Yes, I think that would be my response.
Right. Thank you so much. Yes, Dorcas, would you like to say any quick concluding remarks, or Shepo? Otherwise, we can thank people for attending. Is that an okay sign?
Sorry, can I say something?
Yes, of course, please.
Yes, maybe it's in connection with the situation in the Vaal. What I would also want to make known is the fact that Vaal has been very, very repressed throughout the years. If we remember that in the Vaal, we also had the bus boycott. And the fact that what Francisca has also mentioned about the rent boycotts, it looks like the security forces have always understood how volatile the Vaal is and have made it their business to really, really suppress whatever happens in the Vaal. There are people who left the country even before the 1984. People like Buntate Sandamela, Ntate Levi Mbata was in prison, and there are a number of people who have always been involved. Buntate Patang, Buntate Muliko, who was also a member of the ANC previously. So the only thing that I wanted to mention that really needs maybe further research or engagement is to find out, to find out all of those people of the then, so that we also begin to understand more about some of the things that they were busy with. I think so far I am okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Shepo, would you like to say anything? Or Francesca?
Chair, and nothing from my side except to say, to congratulate Francesca for a job well done.
Yes, I think we all agree that this book, I haven't had a chance to read it either, but from everything I've heard and from this discussion, it seems to be a really, really important contribution to the historiography. Thank you everyone for coming to the webinar. Thank you for the participants. Thank you to the author for gifting the world this book. The next, you'll receive an email on the next history workshop webinar. And if you want to review this webinar, please check out our YouTube channel. So that will be the end of today's webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks all. Congratulations, Francesca. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Thank you, Laura.
Keep well, everyone.
Thanks, Laura. Bye.
Bye.